Thunder roared and the wind shrieked like a lost soul as a lone drifter, Gale McCrae, raced across the barren plains of Montana, desperate to escape the unyielding fury of the storm. Rain battered his threadbare coat and soaked the dust from his weathered boots. Each pitiful step was accompanied by the relentless howl of nature, a symphony of despair that mirrored the guilt in his heart. For Gale, the storm was more than nature's wrath. It was a vengeful mirror reflecting the past he wished he could forget. He had once failed to save someone dear, and that regret haunted his every journey. Now, driven by that agony and a need for redemption, he sought shelter wherever fate might provide it. In the distance, a solitary cabin emerged, its silhouette uncertain against the tumultuous skies. Gale's heart quickened. Hope mingled with apprehension as he spurred his tired horse toward the modest structure. The cabin, its weathered wood and sagging roof bearing the scars of centuries, seemed a relic from another time, a lone sanctuary in the endless, wild expanse of the frontier. As he approached, the clatter of hooves and the biting wind faded into a preliminary lull, replaced by the creak of ancient timbers and a peculiar, desperate sound from within. Gale dismounted and, with cautious urgency, drew near to the cabin's door. Flickering candlelight spilled through a grimy window, casting wavering shadows on the frozen earth. The door stood ajar, as if inviting him to uncover its secrets. A silence, heavy and foreboding, greeted him as he stepped over the threshold. Rainwater pooled on the rough-hewn floor, and the dank smell of wet wood and stale air enveloped him. Yet what caught his eyes was not the state of the humble abode, but a scene that would forever imprint itself upon his soul. In the center of the sole room, near a cold iron stove, lay a woman. Her hair, matted with sweat and rain, spread out around her like a dark halo in the lantern's dim glow. She was bound by coarse ropes to a heavy iron chain that secured her wrist to the stove's base. The sight was wrenching. Her clothes torn, her face etched with pain and defiance, and her swollen belly betraying the promise of new life. As she writhed in agony, a muffled cry escaped her lips, a sound that was both a plea and a declaration. The woman was in labor. The storm outside was rivaled only by the storm within her. Gale froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, the world narrowed to the woman's tortured eyes, which, despite the pain, burned with fierce resilience. It was as if she embodied the struggle of every woman who had been beaten down and yet refused to succumb. In that instant, Gale's burden shifted. His own guilt, the memory of failure that had cost a life, seemed insignificant next to her agony and fortitude. He knew that beneath her chains lay not only physical bondage, but the heavy shackle of abuse and captivity inflicted by cruel in-laws who believed she held the secret to a hidden treasure left by her outlaw husband. Without a word, Gale knelt beside the stove. His callous hands, roughened by a life spent in hardship, moved with unexpected tenderness as he untied the ropes that chained her. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice low but resolute, both a promise and an invocation of hope. The woman's eyes, wide with pain yet glimmering with a spark of defiance, met his. In that fleeting, fraught moment, an unspoken bond was forged between Savior and saved. A trace of redemption in his heart found its purpose. As Gale pulled her free, the wind outside stirred the cabin's tattered curtains, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled like an ominous drumbeat. The woman slumped forward, exhausted, and with Gale's help, she managed to sit up. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against both physical pain and the memories of her past torment. Gale, despite his own exhaustion, offered her water from a battered canteen and carefully unlatched the last of her bonds. "You're safe now," he murmured, though his eyes betrayed the knowledge that safety, in these lawless lands, was often as fleeting as a desert mirage. The woman's lips trembled as she replied in a voice barely audible above the storm, I was left for dead." Her words, laden with sorrow and the remnants of abuse, sent a chill through Gale's soul. He had seen too many broken lives, too many souls left to perish in the unforgiving wasteland, and he could not let hers slip away. Outside, the storm continued unabated, yet inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to kindle. Gale quickly set about kindling a small fire on the stove, coaxing life from the embers until the room was bathed in an amber glow. He helped her to a rough wooden bench near the dying fire, draping a threadbare blanket about her shoulders. The woman's eyes, reflecting both pain and a slow-building hope, locked with his. "My name is Mary Ann," she said softly, as if confessing a secret long held in isolation. They intended to use me as a bargaining chip for something beyond my womb." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, combining with the low murmur of the rain and the steady beat of the distant thunder. As Mary Ann attempted to regain her composure, Gale's thoughts churned. His own past was fraught with regret and loss, a failure to save a friend whose laughter had once brightened his darkest days. He had wandered these lands in search of absolution, never imagining that his path would lead him to the chained woman in labor. But fate, in its enigmatic cruelty, had drawn him here. Now, as the storm battered the world outside, inside the cabin, a quiet promise of redemption began to take root. The tender crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of Mary Ann's labored breaths were abruptly overshadowed by a distant, unsettling sound, a heavy, deliberate knock at the cabin door. It echoed in the cramped space, filled with the raw emotion of the moment. Gale's chest tightened. His instincts, honed by years of wandering and haunted memories, screamed caution. The knock repeated, persistent, demanding. Could it be the in-laws still searching for their prize? Or perhaps something far more sinister, lurking in the relentless darkness of the storm? Mary Ann, her eyes wide with both fear and determination, clutched the blanket to her chest as if it were a shield against the unknown. Gale rose slowly, his fingers tightening around the worn handle of his revolver. "Stay here," he ordered in a hushed tone that belied the gravity of the threat. His silhouette edged toward the door, every step measured against the howling wind outside. In that moment, the storm's fury seemed to crescendo, as if the heavens themselves were heralding this final trial. The door shuddered with each knock, and the sound of running water from a nearby river mingled with the thunder's rumble. Gale paused, listening intently for any clue, a voice, a pause that might grant warning. The oppressive silence that followed was broken only by the unyielding beat of his heart and the distant call of a coyote. His hand, steady yet anxious, crept toward the door as he prepared to confront whatever fate had in store. As Gale's grip tightens on the revolver and the echo of the knock mixes with the storm's roar, the cabin stands on the precipice of a confrontation. Will the approaching threat shatter the fragile sanctuary, or is there yet a path to redemption waiting in the darkness? The relentless knock at the cabin door reverberated through the storm-soaked silence, blending with the howl of the Montana wind and the steady drumming of rain on the warped wood. Gale McCrae's grip tightened on his revolver as he stepped away from Mary Ann, whose labored breaths and quiet moans still filled the small, dimly lit cabin. In that charged moment, the sound of the knock, persistent, insistent, became a herald of the danger lurking beyond the battered door. The storm's fury, long the backdrop of their desperate flight, now seemed to conspire with fate to keep them from peaceful refuge. Mary Ann, strapped to the iron stove mere moments before, now sat against a rough-hewn wooden chair near a small, flickering oil lamp. Her face, pale with pain yet resolute despite every tremor of agony, turned her eyes toward Gale with an expression that mingled fear with hope. "They're still out there," she managed in a strained whisper, the sound nearly lost in the symphony of the storm. "And they know." Her voice, brittle yet determined, was like a plea for salvation, a quiet reminder of her tormented past and secret burdens. Gale nodded solemnly, his thoughts a turbulent mix of remorse and resolve, for he had once failed to save another and now could not let that failure be repeated. Drawing a slow, deliberate breath, Gale approached the heavy door. The oil lamp's glow danced on his rugged features, and his eyes, haunted by regret yet glistening with a faint spark of redemption, scanned the darkness outside. The knock resumed, this time interspersed with a scraping sound that suggested not mere insistence but urgency. With every measured step, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind swirling and battering the cabin walls, as if echoing the inner turmoil of its occupants. Before Gale could fully open the door, a sudden, muffled cry filtered to the tempest, a cry of distress that might have come from a wounded animal or, more ominously, from a man or woman in dire peril. It was too heart-wrenching to be mistaken for the natural chorus of the wild. Gale paused, his hand hovering over the doorframe, his gaze narrowing as he listened intently. The cry was brief, laced with pain and terror, and then silence reclaimed the space. It was a sound that stirred something deep within him, a reminder that every life is fragile, and every moment of safety is a gift hard won. Mary Ann's fingers brushed a pendant that lay hidden beneath her tattered shawl. That small silver token, a relic from a more innocent past, had long been synonymous with bound promises and shattered dreams. Now it glinted dully in the lamp's uncertain light, a symbol of both her suffering and the hope of what might be reclaimed. "Gale," she murmured, "if that cry meant another of them is coming, I want to face it. I won't hide any longer." Her tone was raw and unguarded, a whispered vow to her unborn child and herself that her life would no longer be dictated by fear. Gale's heart ached at her vulnerable defiance. He had wandered these desolate lands, burdened with guilt and regret, and now here was Mary Ann, a woman who, even as she gasped in pain, exuded a courage that defied her chains of past abuse. "We stand together," he intoned in a low voice filled with quiet resolve. "I will not let them break us, for your sake and for mine." His words, heavy with the promise of protection and redemption, bolstered the fragile courage building in the small space. As Gale finally swung the door open a crack, a cold gust of wind burst through, carrying with a scrap of damp cloth and a faint, acrid scent of burning sage. Across the threshold, barely visible in the shifting darkness and strobing rain, a shadow flitted past, a silhouette that seemed to merge with a restless storm. For a long, heart-stopping second, Gale could only stare. The figure's movement was swift, predatory, and undeniably human. A single broken boot print, glistening with mud and illuminated by the intermittent flash of lightning, testified that this intrusion was no mere animal's doing. Without a word, Gale slammed the door shut, trapping the unknown in the corridor for a fleeting moment before drawing his revolver along with Mary Ann into the center of the room. "Stay down," he whispered, though his own voice trembled ever so slightly. The pause stretched endless, the walls closing with the weight of their shared dread. Outside, the storm drummed on, and the dark, ambiguous shapes of approaching riders were now rising on the horizon. In the flickering lantern light, Mary Ann's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I have a secret," she admitted in a hoarse whisper as Gale guided her to the small cot near the stove. "My late husband, he hid something, the key to a treasure my in-laws covet. They believed I knew its whereabouts." Her revelation came slowly, each syllable heavy with the emotions of abuse and betrayal, yet also with the defiant determination of a woman who had suffered too much. Gale listened, his heart aching for the burden she bore, feeling once more the sting of his own past failures. The truth of her words deepened the significance of the silver locket at her side, a subtle, silent testament to the secrets and legacy of a life marred by cruelty. As the hours passed in the wake of that tense exchange, the cabin became a crucible of quiet determination. Gale, with steady hands and a resolve tempered by personal loss, doused a small bundle of tea over a crackling fire. He helped Mary Ann sit upright, easing her discomfort with gentle reassurances. Outside, the storm's fury gradually began to relent, yet the threat of the unknown lingered like a specter in the chilled air. The soft susurration of the wind through the brittle bark of the nearby pines was interwoven with the plain, unsteady beating of anxious hearts. In a moment of fragile calm, Gale and Mary Ann sat together, their silence speaking volumes. The drifter's eyes, dark and reflective, met her tear-filled gaze, and in that exchange a quiet understanding passed between them, a promise of protection, a vow to defy the darkness that sought to reclaim them. "We will decipher the truth behind this locket," he murmured, steady as a stone. "If it holds the secret they crave, then we will unlock its mysteries before they can use it to harm you or any of us." The pledge hung in the air, thick with the hope of a future reclaimed from the ashes of abuse. Yet, as the cabin's fragile warmth began to defy the encroaching chill of night's remnants, an unsettling sound erupted from outside, a low, unmistakable rumble that grew steadily, like the sound of approaching hooves returning with renewed purpose. Gale's eyes flashed as he rose to the window, peering outward into the swirl of dust and fading storm. In the distance, a cluster of figures emerged along a narrow trail, their forms shrouded in the waning gloom of pre-dawn. It was a sound that raised every hair on his arms, a confirmation that the threat was far from over. Marianne, sensing the renewed peril, gripped Gale's hand tightly, her own resolve hardening. "We have little time," she said, her voice strong despite the pain. "They are coming back for us, for the secret, for everything." Her words, laden with emotion and defiance, resonated with an urgency that filled the small cabin with a renewed energy. Gale nodded grimly and stepped away from the window, his eyes fixed on the approaching silhouettes as he prepared himself for the next confrontation. As the distant figures drew nearer, their low voices becoming indistinguishable from the murmuring wind, Gale gathered his courage to ready the cabin's defenses. The locket's cool gleam in Marianne's trembling hand was now a rallying symbol of the hope they clung to, a hope that, although fragile, would not be easily shattered. Every moment stretched with foreboding promise, as the world outside darkened once again with the impending arrival of their adversaries. As the approaching figures merged with the swirling desert dusk and the locket's secrets linger in the trembling air, Gale and Mary embraced themselves. With a renewed threat expose a hidden truth and tear apart their delicate sanctuary, or would forge an unbreakable bond in their fight for salvation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats throbbed in the fading gloom as Gale McCrae peered through a cracked window, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribcage. Outside the cabin, the storm's fury had softened into a restless, eerie calm. Yet the murmuring echo of the rider's arrival still danced on the wind, a spectral reminder of the cruel in-laws determined to reclaim their prize. Marianne's labored breaths, punctuated by tight, pained gasps, filled the silence of the small, lantern-lit room. Her eyes, half-closed in agony, flickered with the tension of imminent birth and the terror of exposure. Clutched tightly in her hand, the silver locket shimmered under the soft glow, its intricate engraving hinting at secrets, treasures concealed long ago and now coveted by those who enslave her. Gale's grip on his revolver loosened slightly as he exchanged a look with Marianne, one that spoke of shared vulnerability and a determined promise. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice a low, steady cadence that seemed to calm the tempest both outside and in her eyes. The steadily increasing sound of hooves and the creak of wooden wheels resonated through the cabin walls as the approaching riders neared the door. Every thud of their arrival struck like a countdown to an unavoidable reckoning. Marianne's contractions intensified suddenly, and she gasped, her body tensing beneath the weight of unshed pain and emerging strength. Gale rushed to her side, setting aside his apprehension for the sake of her and the unborn child. With careful, supportive hands, he helped her sit upright on an old, splintered bench near the stove. "We must be strong," he whispered. "You are not alone." His tone, imbued with the quiet redemption of a man haunted by past failure, carried a promised protection that steadied her trembling form. Outside, in the mounting dusk, a solitary figure emerged at the cabin's door, a rider whose silhouette loomed indistinct against the silver haze of the early night. Gale's eyes narrowed as he cautiously stepped toward the threshold, ever alert to danger. With each echoing hoofbeat, the tension in the cabin thickened, until the door swung open with a sharp creak. In that fraught instant, a single breath escaped Marianne, a sound that was more a prayer than a cry. The figure paused in the doorway, and for several heartbeats, silence reigned. Then, in a voice barely carried by the wind, the stranger spoke. "This is a warning. Amos's men are near. Surrender now the secret you hold, or suffer for it." The words sliced a fragile calm like a slash of ice, and Gale's heart hammered in his ears. The name Amos, an embodiment of greed and cruelty, echoed in the dim light, recalling all the pain and oppression that had plagued Mary Ann. Her eyes widened in horror and defiance, and the locket in her grasp seemed to burn with fierce, unyielding light. Gale squared his shoulders and stepped forward, a silent challenge in his gaze. "Get out," he commanded, his tone low and resolute, echoing like a solemn oath. The rider faltered, then, with a snarl, retreated back into the storm, leaving behind a scrap of damp paper that fluttered the floor, a note with jagged script that promised further retribution. The cabin was filled with a heavy silence as Mary Ann's eyes filled with tears that mingled with determination. "He intends to use what I carry to find the treasure," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. Gale knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "That locket, your token from your past, it may hold the clues they seek. But tonight, it is our shield, and nothing will let it fall into the wrong hands." His words, though simple, resonated with the promise of redemption he so desperately sought. As the temporary threat receded, the relentless labor of childbirth pressed upon Mary Ann. Her contractions came harder, each wave a mingling of agony and the promise of new life. Gale hurried to fetch water from a battered pot over fire and, with nimble care, helped compress a cloth against her brow. Between ragged breaths, Marian offered snippets of memory, of a husband whose life was stolen by treachery, of in-laws who had bound her both physically and in spirit, and of a secret treasure that had been the cause of all. "They believe my husband hid the map to a fortune," she confided softly, her eyes never leaving the glint of her locket. "All I ever had left was this piece of metal, worn with my tears and their lies." The room was heavy with unsaid sorrow and unspoken vows. In the flickering light of the lantern, Gale's expression hardened with both empathy and a burning resolve to right the wrongs of their past. His own history, though shrouded in regret and loss, now found solace in the need to protect and redeem. "We will not allow them to steal your truth," he vowed, voice steady against the storm outside. "You and your child and this locket, these are what we fight for." Amid the tender chaos of approaching labor and whispered confessions, a subtle sound at the window drew Gale's attention once more. It was not the harsh clamor of a full assault, but a soft, measured tap, a signal that the threat had not entirely vanished. Gale crept to the window and peered out into the fog-swathed darkness. Through the haze, he caught sight of a lone figure moving stealthily along the tree-line. A scout, perhaps, sent by Amos to ensure that nothing was amiss. His heart clenched, but he quickly withdrew from the window to rejoin Mary Ann and her anguished labor. The moments ticked slowly as Mary Ann's cries grew louder, and the strain of childbirth etched deeper lines of pain across her face. Gale, never leaving her side, whispered words of reassurance that mingled with the crackling of the fire and the distant, haunting calls of a lone coyote. The cabin itself seemed to shiver with anticipation, each creak a reminder of both their precarious refuge in the vast, unforgiving world outside. The silver locket lay heavy on Mary Ann's chest, a symbol of hope, fear, and the secret that had cost her so dearly. In the near darkness, as the wind began to calm and the distant hoofs faded into an uneasy quiet, Gale finally sensed a subtle shift, a sense that the scout had departed, leaving behind only the bitter promise of what Amos might still be planning. Yet the reprieve was as fragile as a whisper. The air grew denser as Mary Ann's agony reached a new crescendo, her cries mingling with the soft moans of a woman on the brink of transformation. Gale's eyes met hers in that intense moment, a silent prayer for strength shared between them, when a sudden, unexpected sound shattered their tenuous calm. A sharp rap, followed by a prolonged, echoing knock at the door, cut through the layers of fatigue and hope. Gale's heart pounded anew as he glanced at Mary Ann, who, despite her pain, raised her chin with defiant courage. "They are not yet finished with us," she murmured, voice raw with both sorrow and determination. Gale stepped carefully toward the door, ready once more to confront the persistent threat that stalked them through the storm and darkness. Before he could open it, a note was flung to the small gap, a scrap of wet paper bearing a single, ominous line in jagged handwriting. "The treasure will be ours. Surrender now, or your suffering shall multiply." Gale's knuckles whitened around his revolver as he held the note aloft, the words stinging with the cold bite of betrayal and greed. Marianne clutched the locket tighter, as if to merge her fragile hope with Gale's quiet courage. Their eyes, mirroring shared resilience, locked in a silent vow. This was not merely about survival. It was about reclaiming a dignity stolen by cruelty, about protecting a new life born of anguish and yearning. In that fraught instant, as the final echoes of the knock died away and the storm's residual murmur filled the room, a feeling of dread mingled subtly with the promise of rebirth. The hidden secret of the locket, the map to a fortune that had been both a burden and a means of exploitation, loomed over them. Every moment now was laden with urgent questions. Could they unearth the truth before Amos's men closed in? Would the secret remain safe in the fragile sanctuary of the cabin? Gale's voice broke the silence as he spoke, low and unyielding. We must act quickly, prepare for a struggle unlike any before. Our survival, and the truth contained in that locket, depends on it. His words, resolute and somber, sent a shiver through the very walls of the cabin. As Marianne's labor surged into a tempest of pain and hope, and the night's uncertainty pressed on all sides, the weight of the inescapable conflict settled over them like a shroud. With the ominous note clutched in Gale's hand and the cries of imminent danger echoing in the storm's dying light, will their fragile haven and the secret of the locket withstand the relentless tide of cruelty, and can redemption be found before darkness claims them once more? The cold scrap of paper still smoldering in Gale's grasp barely had time to settle, when the distant echo of hoofbeats returned with renewed urgency. The storm's fury had eased into an eerie, almost spectral calm, yet the air pulsed with tension. Gale's eyes, dark and haunted, flickered over the note's jagged script, its ominous words etched into his memory like scars. Marianne's labored gasp cut sharply through the stillness as she clutched the silver locket, its surface catching the flickering lantern light and glimmering with secret that threatened to upend their fragile sanctuary. Outside, the pre-dawn gloom deepened as a lone rider emerged from the swirling dust, his silhouette a dark smear against the rosy hints of an approaching sunrise. Gale positioned himself beside the cabin door, revolver in hand, while Marianne, shivering in the cold, drew closer. Her breath was ragged, each contraction a tempest of pain and hope. "They're here," she whispered, voice quivering yet determined, as if daring fate to strike. Gale's jaw tightened in silence. The note had confirmed that Amos and his men were relentless in their pursuit, not only for the secret that the locket symbolized, but also to continue the torment that had bound Marianne for so long. In that charged moment, a sudden shout echoed from the porch. A scout had been seen moving into the sparse light along the eastern ridge, a thin man, desperate and fearful, bearing an expression of grim urgency. The cry was brief and disjointed, yet it carried the unmistakable sound of warning. Gale's heart hammered as he signaled silently for Marianne to retreat further into the cabin's sacrificial shadows. The scout's presence was a harbinger. He was no ordinary wanderer, but a messenger of the in-laws sent to measure their vulnerability. With deliberate caution, Gale crept to the half-open door, peering into the murk. The scout, scarcely more than a wraith, had left behind a small scrap of cloth snagged on a splintered post. It bore a faded insignia, Amos's mark, a grim reminder that their tormentors were not only near, but methodical. Gale retrieved the scrap, folding it with trembling fingers. "They want us to know they are watching," he murmured, more to himself than to Marianne, whose eyes met his with mingled fear and defiance. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew denser as Marianne's contractions deepened. The very air seemed thick with the scent of cedar smoke, mingling with the salt of unshed tears and the underlying tang of anticipation. Gale knelt beside her on a creaking bench, using his worn sleeve to wipe perspiration and rain from her brow. His voice, soft and reassuring, broke the heavy silence. "Marianne, steady now. I'm here. We'll face whatever comes." His words, simple but imbued with heartfelt determination, were a promise, a quiet oath that redemption might yet be claimed even at the edge of despair. Marianne's eyes, dammed with both pain and resilience, clutched the pendant as if it were only linked to a past rife with betrayal. I remember the day my husband vanished," she whispered, her tone a blend of nostalgia and anguish. "They said he hid the secret of our fortune deep in the mountains, but in truth, he hid his heart from me. Now, they believe this locket hold the key." The revelation, softly spoken, saw the locket shimmering ever brighter, a contradiction of pain and promise. Gale's expression, marred by his own regrets, softened as he reached out to steady her shaking hand. "Then we will ensure that secret remains ours," he vowed quietly, every word heavy with the promise of protection. Outside, the soft murmur of the scout's departure was replaced by the rapid clatter of approaching riders. The sound grew, reverberating against the stone and shifting the night into something altogether more ominous. Gale stood and moved toward the door once more, his silhouette merging with the flicker of lantern light as the first outlines of enemy figures became discernible. From the shadows emerged a small band of men, their faces mostly hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and cloaked expressions. They moved with a rehearsed menace, their guns glinting dully even in the scarce light. One of them, taller than the rest, his stance rigid, stepped forward and called out, "Surrender! The treasure you keep is ours by right. You cannot hide forever." Gale's eyes narrowed as he met the challenge. "We hold only what is rightfully ours," he replied coolly, his voice echoing through the narrow room. There was no open gunfight yet, only the charred silence before the storm. Inside, Marianne's pain mingled with dread as she sunk back against a bench, each contraction intensifying as if nature itself echoed her turmoil. The locket in her hand pulsed as if alive, a mysterious heirloom whose engravings hinted not only at treasure, but at a redemptive past now coming to play. For a long, painful moment, the cabin seemed to suspend in a standstill as both sides measured their resolve. Then, by the door, one of the riders, scratchy, desperate, lunged forward in a brief scuffle. Gale's revolver barked sharply, and the attacker staggered backward, a low grunt of pain escaping his lips. The brief clash broke the silence, and the enemy force hesitated, their eyes reflecting uncertainty in the lantern's wavering glow. Yet even this small victory was tempered by the enormity of the siege. The in-laws were here, and their insatiable greed drove them relentlessly. Amid the mounting chaos, a twist of fate revealed itself. As Gale steeled himself for further confrontation, one of the figures among the enemy forces, the tall, rigid man, paused, his gaze, lingering over the scattered scrap of cloth in Gale's grasp, darted around as if searching for something else. In that critical moment, Gale recalled a name from his shadowed past, a name he had hoped to forget, Travis McKenna. The resemblance in the insignia and the man's demeanor made Gale's heart freeze in a flash of painful recognition. Had Travis, once a friend turned traitor, somehow allied himself with Amos now? The notion sent a surge of bitter regret through him, for he had once sworn loyalty to a man who had chosen betrayal over honor. Marianne, sensing the shift in the air, rose unsteadily, her gaunt features etched with both terror and fierce defiance. "No, not him," she gasped, her trembling hand pressing harder to the locket. The revelation cut through the charged silence like a jagged scar. Elias, who had not spoken since the confrontation began, fixed his steely gaze on the tall man, his eyes narrow with the weight of unspoken accusation. "Identify yourself," he growled, voice low and resonant, the echo of a promise for redemption that had long haunted his steps. For an agonizing fraction of time, the tall man hesitated, his eyes flickering between defiance and resignation. Then, as if compelled by the recognition of past sins, he lowered his gaze. "Travis McKenna," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of hearts. The name hung in the air heavy with implication. This was a man who had once been a brother in arms to Gale, now found mingling with those determined to exploit Marianne's suffering and the secret of the locket. The news struck Gale like a harsh winter wind. His face, already drawn with fatigue and regret, tightened into a mask of steely determination. "So, betrayal runs deeper than I feared," he murmured, the bitter taste of his past failures resurfacing. In that moment, every hardship, every failed promise, fueled his resolve. "You will answer for your treachery," he declared, his voice firm, though the promise was laced with sorrow for what might have been. Marianne's hand trembled as she grasped the locket, a symbol of her past and now, her uncertain future. "I will not be used as a pawn," she said, her voice low but commanding, defiance radiating from her very core. The room reverberated with the strain of what was to come, an inevitable confrontation between those who sought to chain them to a life of subjugation, and those who, through blood and redemption, had come to reclaim their freedom. The horns and distant echoes of approaching riders grew louder still, the sound merging with the pounding in Gale's ears. In that fragile moment in the dimly lit cabin, with the weight of betrayal revealing itself and Travis McKenna standing shamed among the enemy, the confrontation hung poised on the brink of catastrophic resolution. The locket, a quiet beacon of hope, remained in Marianne's grasp, its secret waiting to be unlocked. As the chill of impending dawn mingled with the acrid tang of smoke and blood on the wind, Gale's voice cut through the turmoil one final time. "We will fight, even if it must offend every breath for our own redemption." His words, echoing with promise and pain, sealed the stakes of their struggle. Each heartbeat pulsed with the tremor of forgotten dreams and emerging hope, while the sound of encroaching riders signaled that their ultimate test was at hand. With Travis McKenna's betrayal now revealed and thunderous hooves gathering at the door, will Gale and Marianne, bound by pain and hope, be able to unlock the locket's secret and stand united against an enemy from the past? Or will their hard-won sanctuary crumble under the weight of betrayal and imminent bloodshed? A crescendo of distant hoofbeats shattered the uneasy stillness as pre-dawn light bled slowly over the horizon. The cabin's fragile sanctuary, huddled against the Montana wilderness, trembled under the weight of impending confrontation. Gale McCrae, his revolver gripped with quiet resolve, stepped forward into the dim corridor while Marianne, her features etched with both pain and fierce defiance, clutched the silver locket so dear, its intricate engravings now catching the waning firelight like an omen. Behind her, every contraction of her labor was punctuated by a cry that mingled agony with the promise of new life, as if her very body sought to break the cycle of torment imposed by her in-laws. Outside, through the battered door, the figures of Amos's men advanced with deliberate menace. Among them, the traitorous Travis McKenna, once a man Gale had known and regretted losing to betrayal, stood apart, his eyes dark with conflict tie-on and greed. The note Gale had clutched earlier now burned in his memory, the command to surrender the locket's secret. A secret tied to Marianne's late husband's hidden treasure loomed over them like a curse. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of wet sagebrush and cedar smoke, the sound of the wind through broken shutters merging with the echo of approaching danger. "Stand fast," Gale murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper that cut through the suspense. He turned toward Marianne, whose eyes shone like embers despite her pain. "We protect what is ours, your spirit, our hope, everything. I promise you, no man will steal your truth tonight." His words, imbued with guilt from past failures and the fierce desire for redemption, resonated deep in the trembling silence of the cabin. The door burst open with a resonant thud. A volley of gunfire splintered the air, and chaos exploded beyond the threshold. In that moment, Gale and the enemy clashed. His revolver's report mingled with the clattering of hooves and the anguished shouts of men driven by greed. Travis's eyes flickered. For a split second, the ghost of the friend he once was seemed to shimmer behind the mask of a traitor. With deliberate sharpness, Gale stepped into the open, meeting Travis's gaze. "You were one of us once," he said hoarsely, his hand steady despite the fury in his heart. "I trusted you. Now, your treachery ends here." Travis hesitated, conflict warring in his eyes as the rest of Amos's men pressed forward. The enemy, emboldened by the threat in the note, surged with renewed fury. A single bullet whistled past Gale's shoulder, its echo a bitter reminder of the price he had paid before. Marianne's cries grew louder, her body convulsing with pain as the inevitable climax of her labor approached. Among the chaos, as gunfire danced in the cold light of pre-dawn, the silver locket glinted ominously. Gale, seizing a moment of brief clarity, reached for it, pried it gently from Marianne's grasp, and in its polished surface discovered not a map, but an engraving, a delicate inscription in a long-forgotten language that hinted at an inheritance of strength, of hope, and of a promise kept by one who had chosen love over despair. The revelation sparked a subtle tremor through Gale, a realization that the locket was not a mere key to treasure, but a symbol of Marianne's undying spirit, a legacy of living in spite of all cruelties. "It isn't gold you guard," he murmured softly, holding up the pendant for Marianne to see, "but the proof that your heart is unbroken." His words, tender as they were resolute, lent a momentary softness to brutality unfolding at the door. Just then, a staccato of shouts and the rapid clashing of boots interrupted the fragile reprieve. A contingent of Amos's men, emboldened by the uncertainty in Travis's wavering allegiance, surged forward in a final, desperate assault. Gale's revolver roared again in response, and in the ensuing melee, he found himself locked in a brief but fierce standoff with Travis. The traitor's eyes, now a mirror of regret and desperation, met Gale's. I never wanted this," Travis gasped, staggering under the onslaught. "Amos promised me riches. I was lost." In that fragmented admission, the remnant of a conscience emerged. For a heartbeat, Gale hesitated, as if the echoes of their shared past had the power to diffuse the violence. But the sound of another gunshot shattered that fragile pause. Marianne, clutching her belly as yet another contraction seized her, cried out in anguish that mingled with a primal determination. Gale, torn between defending his newfound family and aiding her through the desperate throes of childbirth, shouted, "Hold on, Marianne. I won't let them take you." He pulled her gently back into the warmth of the cabin's interior as the ferocity of the confrontation raged outside. The sound of gunfire and the thumping of heavy boots cascaded over the cabin like a dreadful tide. Amid the clamor, the pre-dawn sky began to lighten with the faintest rose and gold. In that surreal hour, when darkness and light contended in the heavens, Gale and Marianne huddled close, their shared breath forging an unspoken pact of survival. With Travis crumpled at his feet, his confession still echoing in the charged silence, Gale gathered the wounded remnants of the enemy retreat and, with expert precision, forced them back into the wilderness. Still, the maniacal threat of Amos lingered like a specter in the corners of the night. Inside the cabin, as the standoff waned, Marianne's labor reached a fevered pitch. Gale, casting one anguished glance at the door, knelt beside her again. The fire's dying embers glowed like fragile hope as he whispered words of comfort, recounting memories of lost lives and the promise of new beginnings. "You will bring forth life that no greed can tarnish," he said, as Marianne's cries softened to an almost mystical cadence. In the midst of that raw, human moment, the silver locket was returned to its rightful place around her neck. It was no longer a symbol of the past pain, but an emblem of the future's potential. With trembling hands and fierce determination, Marianne, supported by Gale's steady presence, finally embraced the climax of her labor. A piercing cry, equal parts agony and triumph, filled the cabin as a newborn's first gasp pierced the gloom. In that miraculous sound, the tumult of the last hours transformed into a beacon of redemption. Tears streamed down Gale's weathered face as he witnessed Marianne's defiant joy, a woman reclaiming not only her life, but forging a future with every exhaled breath. But even as the infant's cry mingled with the soft cooing of relief, a sudden, jarring sound shattered the fragile peace. A clatter at the window, as if a final remnant of the enemy had returned. Gale and Marianne exchanged one last, charged look, a silent acknowledgment that while the immediate battle waned, the war against the cruelty of the past was ever lingering. The cold wind rattled the shutters, and the footprint of Amos's men were still visible in the melting snows outside. For a long moment, time held its breath. Gale, still gripping his revolver with a steady hand, stepped to the window and peered out into the awakening wilderness. There, amidst the fading shadows, a single figure stood, a man whose identity was obscured by the early light, but whose presence sent a ripple of dread through the cabin. Had Amos himself arrived, or was it another specter of treachery, returning to claim what was never theirs? That final question hung in the charged air as the newborn's cries softened into gentle cooing, and the promise of a new life began to dawn alongside the coming sun. As the solitary figure remained silhouetted in the pale light of dawn, the fragile peace of the cabin is shattered by the unyielding question: will the legacy of cruelty finally be vanquished, or does the specter of Amos still hold them in its relentless grasp? Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable Wild West journey. If you were moved by the courage and redemption in our final chapter, please subscribe, hit the bell for more stories, and share your thoughts below. Which moment touched your heart the most? Stay tuned for more tales of grit, survival, and hope from the frontier.